Hello, I'm Lars Meyer, Visiting Program Officer for Preservation at the Association of Research Libraries and Senior Director, Content Division at Emory University Libraries, where my responsibilities include managing preservation. Today's webcast is organized by the Association of Research Libraries, whose 123 members include many of the largest libraries in the United States and Canada. Thank you for joining us today as we explore how libraries are addressing preservation issues and challenges and identifying opportunities for collaboration. I'm joined today by Jim Neal, Vice President for Information Services and University Librarian at Columbia University, and Deborah Jakubs, the Rita DiGiallonardo Holloway University Librarian and Vice Provost for Library Affairs at Duke University. Rather than review my recently completed report, Safeguarding Collections at the Dawn of the 21st Century, describing roles in measuring contemporary preservation activities in the ARL Libraries, we're going to offer reactions to its findings and field questions from the webcast audience. I'll be taking a practitioner perspective, Deborah will offer insights from the library context, and Jim will reflect on national, international, and collaborative opportunities and challenges for preservation. In order to anchor today's discussion, I want to review assumptions that went into the aforementioned report and also share some observations about preservation that I began to develop during the writing of the report and that I've subsequently thought more about since continuing the dialogue about preservation with colleagues. My first assumption is that research libraries continue to be profoundly affected by digital technologies that influence user behaviors and expectations. Admittedly, this is self-evident, but I mention it because in the course of completing my report, user expectations, particularly for all things digital, was a recurring theme that served to catalyze many discussions about how digital technologies affect preservation philosophy and work. Therefore, preservation must be sensitive to this significant driver for research libraries. Second assumption is that libraries continue to balance the preservation of physical collections, such as books, paper, and audiovisual media on one hand, and digital content on the other. In other words, it's not a matter of managing physical collections or digital content, but rather about managing a continuum of seemingly related responsibilities and activities. Some of my comments below will return to this because there's uncertainty about which staff are participating in the continuum of preservation activities, and moreover, uncertainty about who oversees the preservation space in libraries. The third assumption is that funds have always been and will continue to be insufficient to address all preservation needs in a library. This is particularly problematic because the purview of preservation is continually expanding. Preservation is no longer, and hasn't been for some time, simply associated with books and paper and other physical media. Preservation is nowadays also concerned with digital content that a given library might create, purchase, or license access to. The last assumption is that collaboration and creation of shared community resources and preservation strategies are essential, particularly in regard to preserving digital content. Collaboration has the potential to alleviate some of the aforementioned financial concerns. I say might because collaboration, of course, comes at a price. Within the context of these assumptions, I want to now share some of my observations about the way that preservation work is evolving. It's from the practitioner's perspective that I'm presenting today again. Many of the observations will be phrased as questions that reflect concerns in the current preservation landscape. I believe that today's libraries are dealing with preservation activities that can be roughly organized into three categories or groupings. Some of the activities are well understood, some are about finding our way with new technologies and expectations, and some are desired stretch activities that are just now being discussed or that are in the early stages of R&D. First category of activity includes the work that's well understood. Book repair, conservation, library binding, mass deacidification, and user and staff education typify what I mean. In other words, we know how to get the work done in these areas. We understand these tools and technologies, and we're able to measure return on investment. Nonetheless, preservation librarians and colleagues in collection development are asking questions about these well-understood traditional core preservation activities. Questions being asked are not along the lines of how do we do these, but rather why are we doing them? What is their value in today's library operations? Can we continue to justify these and other preservation activities? More specifically, what is the value of the physical object, particularly books in light of Google developments? If books continue to have value, as I believe they will we keep them on site? If not, how many off-site copies do we preserve locally, regionally, or nationally? We are asked, and we ask ourselves, which preservation activities are more strategic than others? Given that many of today's users are dependent upon digital tools, what are today's drivers for preservation work? What are the customer needs? In light of these concerns, how should preservation activities be prioritized? To what extent should particular activities be resourced? What data beyond transactional metrics do we use to justify preservation expenditures? How do we measure the impact of our work on users? The second of my categories for conceptualizing preservation activities reflects some of my observations about how members of the preservation community, including myself, are finding our way with new technologies and expectations. About 10 years ago, the flow of preservation was significantly disrupted by digital technologies. On the one hand, disruptive technologies like affordable digital conversion tools allowed us to address materials in our collections that were previously underrepresented by preservation activities, such as sound recordings and moving images. On the other hand, the same technologies raise concerns about how to preserve the digital objects that we create. Digitization technologies also challenge preservation librarians as well as catalogers and archivists to learn more about metadata. For me, it's difficult to perceive preservation work without giving a lot of thought to metadata. At Emory, for example, we create metadata in the course of completing conservation treatments, as well as during digital conversion activities. In fact, there's an organizational expectation that my staff and I are versed in metadata. Metadata is what connects preservation work to broader library endeavors. Changes in the publishing landscape are the primary catalyst for discussions about and early experimentation with what I'll call desired or stretched preservation activities, the third of my categories for preservation work. Publishing has become more immediate, personal, and multimedia. Valuable content outside of typical scholarly communication channels now appears ubiquitously on the web in the form of text, moving images, and sound. Moreover, it has become intricately interconnected. There's now a complex networked environment. So who's responsible for preserving the content in this environment? How do we capture the content and provide access while maintaining context? Providing or maintaining context is a key preservation goal. Furthermore, how do we address the rights issues? In regard to rights issues, we're still grappling with the preservation of copyrighted e-journal and database content that we license access to but don't own. All three of these categories of work, the well understood, finding our way with new technologies and expectations, and responding to the publishing landscape, touch upon the theme of collections. During the course of the project, discussions about preservation naturally tended to incorporate concerns and ideas about collections. Of course, research libraries have always championed the preservation of the cultural record as one of their chief aims, yet the day-to-day measurable preservation activities were largely the domain of department or unit. It's become clear to me that we can't think of developing collections that consist in some part of digital content without also developing a new and expanded scope of preservation. Perhaps more importantly, we need to extend our view of who is doing the work of preservation. Nowadays, preservation activities can be found in units throughout a library and even amongst libraries and collaborative efforts. Digital reformatting, although it's probably not called that, is being done by special collections departments and music libraries, oftentimes with some acknowledgement of serving a preservation need, though it's not likely the primary driver. Work in the area of preserving digital content is taking the form of collaborative effort among several institutions. Many of these projects are funded by NDIP and focus on R&D. These efforts indicate to me that preservation responsibilities in many libraries has tangibly, not just philosophically, become more broadly embedded in operations throughout the organization. Today, there's much talk about the life cycle of information resources. Digital curation has entered into our vocabularies, and it's causing us to engage in discussions about the reuse of content, particularly digital content. Users expect to get relevant information quickly and dependably. Simply put, there's a growing user expectation, although not necessarily explicit, that libraries prepare content, particularly digital content, for reuse, raising questions and concerns about the preservation of the original object, physical or born digital, its surrogates, derivatives, and variants. We're also thinking more about how to work with content creators, such as living authors whose manuscripts we acquire, or scientists who create data sets that might be of use to others. Some argue that this is the stuff of special collections nowadays. Perhaps that's why I'm seeing efforts to initiate discussions about preservation with content creators by colleagues throughout my library. Special collections and data center staff come to mind, but I also hear from subject librarians being approached by faculty about these issues. I see the expansion and decentralization of preservation as an opportunity because it's causing me to have conversations with and also pursue common projects with colleagues who 10 years ago would have had little interaction with preservation. In my case, I work with computer scientists on preservation, access, repository, and digital curation issues, with metadata librarians on description and management of digital content. My staff increasingly work on preparing special collections materials for exhibit in collaboration with gallery staff and curators. And I'm responsible for shepherding the conversion of my library's public domain content for digital access. I think that these kinds of collaborative approaches are ideal because they bring talent and knowledge to preservation from a wide variety of backgrounds. But maybe I'm also idealizing these collaborations. Again, in the course of this project, a common concern raised by participants and interviewees was that preservation activities are taking place outside of traditional preservation units. But the issue isn't whether this is good or bad. Rather, it's an acknowledgement that preservation is rapidly evolving. If so, how do we preservation and non-preservation staff alike work in this evolving landscape? More specifically, what does this mean for organizing preservation activities within a library? If we broaden our concept of preservation, does this mean that preservation has become a set of specialized activities only similar or related in philosophy and intent? What is the connection between book conservation and preservation of born digital resources? How are these activities best organized within a library? As a preservation librarian, I feel I have a role in shaping a conversation about the future of preservation, at least as it pertains to my institution. At the same time, I'm aware that there's guidance that the broader community could or might provide. It's these two perspectives, the institutional perspective and the community level perspective, that Deborah and Jen will respectively address. Therefore, let's now turn the discussion over to Deborah.
Thank you, Lars.
Go home.
Duke's president, Richard Broadhead, commented several years ago that the responsibilities of the research library are vast because we must honor the most traditional resources, preserving them and making them accessible, while also looking as far ahead into the future as we can see to anticipate the needs of scholars and students and to take advantage of the technologies available. Preservation can be viewed in this light as well. Just as the definition of collections has expanded from print plus other formats and now plus digital collections, so has the scope and reach of preservation. Lars Meyer has done a fine job of identifying these new directions, and his report should be widely read and discussed. I will elaborate on some of the considerations from an institutional perspective, by no means exhaustive in this brief time. I hope the report and our webcast will give the audience something to think about and to discuss in their own institutions. From conservation of our most special materials through digital curation of faculty research data sets, our preservation efforts determine what persists, what endures, what is available for researchers into the future. This is no small responsibility. This is a challenge, but it is also a welcome opportunity to call attention to an even stronger alignment of the work of the libraries with the goals of our universities. As Winston Atkins, Duke's preservation officer, has commented, it is a, quote, return to first principles as we revisit, remember, recommit ourselves to our job of managing, vetting, and ensuring the availability of the university's resources to scholars and students in the future. At a time when the very definition of a library is being reassessed and expanded, and we are reinventing ourselves to ensure continued relevance to the academic work we have always supported, the emergence of new roles for the library and its preservation function and of new services is welcome indeed. This is all true. So what are the implications for individual research libraries? How can we prepare? What should we keep in mind as we plan? I offer some observations and suggestions, and again with the caveat that this is not an exhaustive list, and I look forward to the questions. The recognition and acceptance of the creation of digital surrogates as a means of preservation for access was a major step forward. The importance of the role of the preservation administrator, overall responsibility for the program, whatever shape that may take at an individual institution, this role will expand as digital curation opportunities arise on campus. The ongoing importance of traditional activities, as Lars has mentioned, and also including disaster planning, environmental monitoring. More collections off-site, which is something we're all seeing, also implies that they will be in better conditions. At least that's true with our off-site facility, and I sleep easy knowing that a lot of our materials are in a very carefully controlled climate. We need to balance the needs of the print collections with digital content. It's not an either-or, as Lars has mentioned. We need to remember that today's stacks contain tomorrow's rare books. The spectrum is much broader and includes many types of web-based content. I see more opportunities for interinstitutional collaboration, again, as Lars has highlighted, kind of as in the old days of cooperative collection development. We need to seek opportunities both to preserve and to create access to unique materials, digital projects, while implementing mass digitization as well. And I think our institution here, our library at Duke, is not alone in highlighting many of our special collections, which are those collections that increasingly differentiate us from other research libraries and which we want to create access to, as broad access as possible. We need to develop new staffing models that include staff beyond conservation and preservation and train them appropriately. I feel that, in general, cross-departmental work in libraries is something that we should all be aspiring to. It works well. There is precedent for this in the involvement of subject specialist librarians in preservation decisions. And again, as Lars has mentioned, there are new collaborators in scholarly communications officers, dealing with rights issues, public services, digital collections staff. metadata specialists, etc. New forms of expertise are needed. Where will these people come from? Lars has identified the various domain expertise is needed, and we must provide opportunities for on-the-job training, cross-training, internships, partnerships with library schools, and to offer non-traditional paths to preservation work, just as many people are finding non-traditional paths to the work of libraries in general. We need to develop policies that will address the largest number of materials at one time and reduce the time spent on individual review, except in certain cases. Identify categories of materials at risk and reformat or develop a plan for their preservation rather than examining individual items. Conservation work is essential to fulfilling our mission. We must ensure that they have enough staff and the specialized skills and professional development and training. In our library, the Conservation Lab is very near the LINC, which is our teaching and learning center, a very high-tech environment, brand new, opened last year. And I find that juxtaposition to be especially important as I tour people through, whether they're donors or faculty, people on campus, to be reminded that we're conserving our special collections in one part of this floor at the same time that our faculty are using technology to teach and in fact to use some of these materials in digital form. We need to rise to the challenge of new kinds of archival materials. For example, electronic literature archives, born digital literary archives, any number of other formats, photographic and moving image collections, and the special challenges they present, such as storage, which is a big issue. The same issue looms large for our data sets and the increasing work that libraries are doing with e-science and e-research. Preservation work, I believe, is now coming out from behind the door to be more visible within the larger institution as the definition of preservation is expanded, and I think this is a very good thing. There's a need for continual learning, networking, and bringing back new ideas, and the opportunities for collaborative digitization projects and shared storage and such, whether in ARL or RLG or other areas, are all to be commended. And I'd like to look on the positive side and the optimistic side that the expansion of the definition of preservation is something that's good for all of us. And I look forward to answering some of your questions and hearing your concerns. And now I turn it over to Jim.
Lars and Deborah have provided us, I think, with an outstanding orientation to the extraordinary challenges we are facing in research libraries as we advance our roles and responsibilities for preserving the cultural and the scientific record. In my remarks, I'd like to extend this discussion to the broader community or national continental level, recognizing that Canadian and U.S. research libraries have a distinctive and rigorous preservation commitment. First, allow me to outline the complexities of our sometimes very schizophrenic preservation challenge. And second, I also intend to highlight what I will refer to as preservation meta-issues, barriers, if you will, to our collective ability to advance a strategic and effective preservation effort. What are our preservation priorities? For me, archive is a legitimate metaphor for preservation because it suggests, for me, a much more complex set of activities. Clearly, we must first view preservation or archive as a repository, the ability, if you will, to hold a physical or digital object. I believe we may have lost the critical connection between preservation and collection development. We cannot preserve what we do not hold or what we have not acquired. Holding something is necessary but insufficient, as we must also link preservation to persistence, to to a commitment for ongoing access and usability. Preservation also implicates a responsibility for safety of the object, a curatorial function that secures it and protects both the survival of the container and the integrity of the content itself. And preservation demands stewardship and ongoing care and sometimes feeding of the object to guarantee its survival and its availability. Research libraries sustain a strong interest in and a capacity for preserving analog content. It's much of our critical and important legacy. Much of our preservation tradition, as Lars and Deborah have noted, is invested in creating stable environmental conditions, repairing and strengthening objects, reformatting for longevity, educating for appropriate use, often with a clear focus on works of paper, vinyl, or film. And as we expand the conversion of analog materials to digital formats, and as we've begun to confront the extraordinary challenge of born digital items, our preservation knowledge and our preservation resources, I think, have been seriously overextended. We recognize that we need to preserve the digital container, the content, and the functionality, even as the tools and the infrastructure are constantly shifting. Preservation or archiving strategies need to be responsive to risks, and disaster preparedness, has been noted, is a fundamental part of our research library planning for preservation. And because of the extraordinary costs involved and the permanent commitment which is required, the permanent commitment, the vocabulary of trust and insurance has entered our preservation conversation. This, I think, has translated into collective solutions, like what I would call the chaotic repository movement, with all of its vulnerabilities and duplication across the nation and across the world. We are increasingly in a period of what I call repository fatigue. Too much accomplishing too little. But I think there are also important arenas like Portico, a trusted publisher library cooperative for securing electronic journals, and the Hoppy Trust, a trusted archive collective with an initial focus on digitized books from research library collections, but with the ability and interest to expand to other formats. Now let me turn briefly to some larger preservation issues which, in my view, are undermining our ability to advance our preservation agenda. We painfully lack national policy and strategic leadership for preservation. I challenge us to identify an organization in North America that is championing and planning our preservation programs. This means that we lack progress on the policy front to build, for example, more expansive exceptions for preservation in our national copyright laws. This means that we lack significant national investment in preservation activities, state, provincial, and federal funding of sufficient magnitude and sustenance to really make a difference in our preservation work. The impact of these gaps is extraordinary and plays out in very, very damaging ways. I'm concerned about a remarkable absence of research in so many areas of preservation. We need to move beyond best practices and standards and look at how we can build a science of preservation. I am heartened by the work being done at Hopkins, supported by the Mellon Foundation, to apply rigorous scientific inquiry into our conservation work. I am also concerned about an erosion of our library and information science education programs in terms of their ability to embrace and incorporate preservation education, and particularly specialist degree initiatives, which I think are very much at risk. I am encouraged by the apparent continuing commitment at the University of Texas, Austin, to refresh and sustain the Certificate in Conservation, especially after a Mellon-sponsored study applauded the quality of the program and the impact of its graduates. And finally, the lack of a well-developed and well-supported national preservation program means that we miss opportunities to build strong relationships and collaborations with other countries and regions that are investing in both analog and digital preservation studies and action at a far more collaborative and comprehensive level than we are currently doing in the United States and in Canada. Where do we find ourselves as research libraries? We face rapidly shifting user behaviors and expectations. We find ourselves trying to sustain redundant and inefficient library operations. We see an increasing emphasis in our community, in our libraries, on unique resources. We seek to achieve scale and network effects through aggregation, new forms of what I would call radical collaboration. We have declining financial resources, obviously, to match up with our expanding preservation needs. And thus, I think, we need to find ways in our preservation programs, in fact, in all aspects of our research library work, to embrace systemic change as a persistent strategy and as a way to accomplish our priority goals. Among those priority goals in research libraries must be our continuing commitment to the preservation and conservation of the collections we have and the collections that we will have. I look forward to our discussions.
Thank you, Jim. The audience is now welcome to submit questions, and we'll be able to see those here. In the meantime, maybe I'll just follow up with Deborah and Jim on some questions that I have. Kind of going back to digital curation, Deborah, you mentioned that, and that being aligned with better aligned with university goals. I was wondering if the question there isn't really about curation in general. It seems like there's a lot of content that's around universities that's not owned or under the purview of the library. Academic departments, administrative units, everybody's creating videos these days. They're up on YouTube. That seems to be good enough as most of the creators see it. But what responsibility, Deborah, do you think we have as a library to trying to gather that stuff and trying to get it folded into a preservation program or activity?
Thanks for the question, Lars. I see this as part of the expanding role, as I mentioned it. Of course, if you look at it on the scale that it's available all across campus all at once, it's kind of a scary prospect. But I definitely think that it's an extension of our role as curators and archivists and protectors and preservers. I think that it's important to develop a strategy with a set of priorities so that you obviously can't bite off the whole thing at once. To deal with particular departments or programs or interdisciplinary initiatives, areas that lend themselves to, that perhaps are more appreciative of the role that the library can play, perhaps willing to help with some resources, go in on some kind of grant proposal together. Again, it's a way I see for the library to get librarians and library staff to get beyond the walls of our buildings and demonstrate the value of our work more broadly across the campus.
I think that responsibility needs to be embraced within the context of our collection development policies at our libraries. We should be collecting from campus intellectual output in the same way we're collecting from publishers and other sources. But I think overlaid in that responsibility very often is our record management policies and procedures. Our responsibility, as Deborah's indicated, to serve as an archive of the university's work. And as we extend that beyond, if you will, the administrative work of the university to the academic output of the university, many of us have built institutional repository infrastructures, but without making, I think, sufficient provision for the long-term preservation and care of those materials. So I think you've asked a very good question, Lars, and I think we need some good collective approaches to this.
Thank you. Questions are beginning to come in. Here's one about priorities for preservation. I think, Deborah, you also touched upon this in terms of cross-departmental collaboration. I don't know if you were talking about within a library or within the organization. But what do we see some of the new challenges in creating that kind of collaboration? I think, Jim, you also mentioned on that we need to kind of bring collection development and preservation back into the same fold. What other opportunities are you seeing with departments within the libraries and then across the organization, perhaps, in trying to move forward preservation? Deborah?
I was thinking in those comments specifically about some successes we've had in the libraries with our digital collections program, which is very much a cross-departmental initiative with a coordinator. There's an endless number of potential organizational models for preservation for libraries for any of the work we do, and I don't think there's any right or wrong model. I do find that the kind of work that has gone on in our digital collections program, which I can also extend to preservation, is a very refreshing way for people who might not otherwise who aren't in the same department, who have similar interests and similar kinds of jobs or similar areas of responsibility to come together with a common purpose. And so I think it's a lot less important that they be, in a particular box under a particular person on a particular organization chart than to highlight the kind of work they do, the goals they have, and what they can contribute to the preservation function.
I think in our context as well, we have found it extremely productive to have the Director of Preservation responsible providing oversight for the actual in-house digitization work that's going on, and also to coordinate and manage our outsourcing mass digitization activities. That brings to front and center of this work an ongoing commitment and understanding of the preservation implications of what we're doing. I think it's also important to, in our research library context, to encourage those who have subject to disciplinary responsibilities within the library to drive the setting of priorities in terms of what gets digitized and the intellectual structures and the preservation decisions that we make around that content. As we now begin to embrace, to the extent that our copyright laws allow us to, as we begin to embrace collection of the web, if you will, important content, documents, websites that we see as integral to our collection development priorities and goals, I think it layers in another set of responsibilities around the disciplined librarian, not only making decisions about what we get, but how we're going to provide long-term availability and usability of that content.
Jim, that's an excellent point, and I think the subject and area librarians are in a very good position to understand what's going on campus, department by department, program by program, and to know what would be of most value to the university.
I have a follow-up question to that. Is can libraries scale up to that? So if we have, we know, for example, that a lot of disciplines are creating kind of research communities, online research communities, developing repositories for their areas. What's the library's role in getting involved in that and preserving some of the exchanges and content that are happening within those research communities, those repositories that are being developed around specific areas of study, for example? Can we scale up?
Yeah, I'm very encouraged and very excited by the work that's being done at a number of institutions, but I would cite in particular the work that's been done at the University of Minnesota with the bioethics community that they have. The libraries provide a lot of the leadership in partnership with the academic disciplines to shape, to populate with content and to make sure that that long-term preservation takes place. Here at Columbia, we're beginning that same conversation around a multidisciplinary community in human rights. And one of the among the responsibilities and expertise we bring to that conversation is that long-time archiving and preservation, not only of the conversation but of the content, very often multimedia content that's deposited in these repositories. This is not unlike the type of difficulty we're experiencing, or the wonderful challenge we're experiencing in our special collections areas, where we're beginning to acquire many resources that include very rich and very important digital content and how we deal with those archives is something for which I think we need much more experience and really some standards and best policies developed. That's true in these communities as well.
And again, I think it's very important for us to reinvent ourselves, to demonstrate on our campuses and beyond that it's not your mother's library. You know, these are new areas.
Or my father's.
Or your father's, right? new challenges for us, and there are roles that the library can play that many people would never have envisioned for us. And I think many of us have had conversations with faculty or others who say, you know, well, is this something the library could do? And increasingly we're saying, yes, that is an area we could move into. So.
And I think that's why my comment about the role of the library education programs, a lot of the schools of library and schools of information, what a critical role they play in inculcating in our new graduates an understanding of, at the policy and strategic level, of where preservation fits in our overall program, so that when they begin to work in libraries, particularly our research libraries, they ask those questions. They're ready to step up and take responsibility and put a commitment on the table to be an important agent in those important academic arenas that are being created. So I think we have to grab it, and in order to grab it, we need to understand it. In order to understand it, I think the educational programs are critical.
So grab it in terms of preservation. So I'm thinking that I keep coming to this point, having conversations with people, that there seems to be a lot of activity that maybe we in preservation see as being, well, that's preservation work, or kind of preservation work, or if only you did this, it'd satisfy a lot of needs. And so I'm wondering if the word preservation, what do we mean by that today? And, you know, I made the point, I think, about people digitizing things in all kinds of departments and units in a library and a campus. And, you know, if we merge that with some kind of commitment for long-term preservation of those digital objects, then maybe we have a program. But I guess I'm just sort of wondering whether the education programs that you mentioned do we think that they're sort of getting people to think along those lines, or is it just really kind of focused on meeting kind of immediate user needs, or something like that?
Well, I'm hoping that our library educators are seeing preservation as a long-term strategic responsibility of libraries, archives, museums, any type of information organization, and that they're not focused in particular on the sort of hands-on preservation work, although I think understanding of some of those techniques are valuable, but looking at this more in terms of the changing nature of library work and the roles and responsibilities that we carry for preserving or sustaining that cultural and scientific record. One area we haven't talked a lot about is the increasing role that we're playing, particularly with our researchers who are producing research data, whether that be scientific data or social science or humanities data. I think that there's a gap, if you will, in terms of the capacity within many of our institutions to manage that resource. And I think we're seeing some early rigorous development in some of our institutions around putting not only the infrastructure in place, but the policies and workflows and procedures that guarantee the long-term availability of that data.
Thank you. I'm looking at kind of several questions that revolve around the value of original objects, and how do we? There's certainly researchers who use them. There seems to be some tension between digitizing things and maybe conserving things on the other hand, and I don't know if both of you want to speak to that and how a library could go about managing that balance, perhaps. Deborah?
Well, we don't have a choice. It's not an either-or option. I think we need to address the whole spectrum, as has been mentioned earlier. We have to remind ourselves that we've never preserved everything. We've never been able to save everything, and so again, you know, harking back to Jim's comments about collection development policies and collaboration, I think this is a good opportunity to look at how how we set priorities for what we keep, what we save, what we preserve, what we conserve, and perhaps do that in a wider context of collaboration.
I think as we digitize collections, we all sort of have to take this oath sort of as librarian physicians, we will do no harm, if you will, to the original items. And clearly, having professional preservation involvement, if not oversight, of our digitization work, help guarantees that that type of protective thinking takes place. Clearly, so much of our digitization work, by definition and by law, has focused on the out-of-copyright content, our special unique materials. Many of us are now beginning to sort of encroach into a semi-orphan works environment where we're beginning to look at certain types of archival materials in our collections for which we feel confident in terms of making digital content available, even though it may be under a copyright protection regime. But that link, if you will, between preservation and digitization is something we have to think, I think, even more aggressively about going forward. I'm in the final stages of writing a report for the Mellon Foundation on the current state and future development of deacidification in our research libraries in North America. And not only are we documenting a tremendous decline, but we're going to call in this report for some expanded linking of digitization and deacidification. That is, can we look at those as complementary processes that we need to implement? And as we build a national, global capacity for last copy print repositories, should we bring deacidification back to the fore as we rely on the Google book version, if you will, of a work, store a certain number of print copies to make sure that that long-term print archive is available, but then make sure that that material is going to be around, particularly if it's in the 19th century work for which deacidification may make sense. So we need to begin to link up a lot of these processes and guarantee not only the long-term preservation of the digital, but the continuing availability when needed of the print or analog version.
Lars, I would like to add one other thing. Here at Duke, the largest user group for our special collections is the undergraduate student body. And it's a very deliberate process in that our librarians identify classes that would lend themselves particularly well to the introduction of primary materials. And they contact the faculty. The faculty are more than happy to bring their students in, organize an entire class or session around some of the materials we have. And so I wouldn't want us ever to lose sight of, the excitement that young people who are born and raised in a digital world still experience when they are faced with some of the primary materials that we have in our collections.
Right. I think this complements some of the questions that are coming in about how as libraries do we prioritize how preservation activities. Since we can't do it all, we have to make some choices. And I think that I've asked this question a lot, and I think there's no one-size-fits-all response. Because I think the library priorities from one library differ to another. Mm-hmm. But how can we best identify priorities within a library? I mean, what roles or what people or what positions would you bring to the table to have that discussion today?
Well, I think preservation priorities need to be linked to institutional or library level priorities. So I think if there's an ongoing commitment, if you will, to within a collections program to gather materials from the web of relevance and quality, then that clearly drives the commitment to the long-term preservation and archiving of that born digital web content. If there's a commitment to special collections, the unique resources in our collections, and many of us embrace that as a very high priority, then we need to maintain some significant level of conservation capacity in order to protect those materials. I find what is beginning to fall between the cracks of managing our digital preservation priority and our special collections unique conservation priority is the circulating collections, the working collections in our libraries, where we've seen a tremendous decline in deacidification activity, a decline in binding activity, and a decline in basic repair activity. And I think, in some respects, we're seeing that priority being somewhat set by default, but also by the resource realities that we're living with.
Deborah, do you have any comments about, in terms of prioritizing preservation within your library, who you would, for example, bring to the conversation?
Well, again, I think it's a partnership among the collections people, the public services people, and the preservation people to, again, align what we, as Jim said earlier, we choose to collect things. And by doing so, we are committing to making them accessible and to preserving them. And I come from a background of cooperative collection development, and have seen that even here within TRLN, the Triangle Research Libraries Network, a long history of cooperative collection development, where an institutional decision is made to focus on a set of areas and to leave other areas to another institution or a set of institutions. And I think that we should not lose track of that tie between preservation and collection development, and whether it's a long history of a particular strength in an academic department on a campus, whether it's a commitment to a regional or national consortium. Those are responsibilities we must honor.
I want to argue, however, that it's important to set priorities at the institutional level, but what I bemoan is the absence of national preservation priorities, largely linked to the gaps that I tried to define in my remarks, where I don't believe we have a national level planning process for preservation. And as a result, I believe we have not been able to advance major policy directions and also major funding directions at the state, or more importantly at the national level. And that, I think, needs to capture the attention of the research library community much more aggressively going forward, because the resource gap, I think, is severe. And given other national priorities coming to the fore, I worry that this is going to get increasingly lost in the shuffle, and groups that have traditionally supported us, like NEH, may not see this as a high priority going forward. And now that we see organizations like NSF stepping forward to turn their attention, appropriately turn their attention to the long-term preservation of research data, are we going to see some losses in other areas of preservation responsibility and priority?
So, Jim, what do you think happened over the last couple decades, 25 years or so? Because preservation, I'm thinking back to my first job, which was at RLG. It was in collections, but not preservation. But preservation was a very big focus, and there was a lot of national attention. So what's happened?
Well, I think other things have stepped forward to drive new priorities and new attention. I think that's been one factor. Two, I think the range of issues that we have to deal with in some ways have sort of disarmed us. When we were focused on conserving the analog materials in our collection, when we were focused on reformatting those materials through preservation microfilming and preservation photocopying techniques. I don't want to say it was simple. I know those were very complex and very challenging processes, but those have not gone away. They've been overlaid by a whole set of new concerns around multimedia, around obviously the digital content that we're dealing with, other types of dynamic information sources that we have no idea how to capture and preserve. So to some extent, I think our energy has been sapped by the complexity and the rigor and the what I used word earlier, the schizophrenic nature of our preservation interest and capacities.
So is it safe to say that preservation issues kind of slipped to the back burner until the digital imperative kind of resurfaced them?
Yes, but I'm not sure we have. I believe they've been resurfaced, and think how many times in a day we use the vocabulary of preservation and archiving. But what I don't see is national leadership around policy, around funding, around priority setting, either in the U.S. and perhaps in Canada, in terms of being able to move this agenda forward. We're not going to be able to rely on institutional resources to get the job done.
No, I agree with you completely.
We're going to have to find some form of what I called earlier radical collaboration, where we build centers of excellence for preservation and conservation, schools that take us on from an educational perspective, libraries that take it on from a science and research perspective, and we really build a capacity to learn much more aggressively from each other and build either co-investment or foundation and federal investment in this area.
So I'm sort of wondering, what is the preservation community's role in trying to get discussions about those things you just mentioned going? So we acknowledge that we have a lack of kind of national leadership. Where could it come from? Who could be talking to whom to get it going? Jim? Deborah?
Well, I think there are some what I would call suspect organizations around the country. Suspect, and they're the right suspect, if you will, to step up and provide some of this leadership. I think to convene expertise, not just from the library preservation community, but from the larger community of people who are doing research on paper, people who are doing at the longevity, looking at longevity issues related to digital formats. So I think the conversation has to reach out significantly beyond what we know in terms of library conservation and preservation. Secondly, I think we have to hone in on some agreed-upon priorities. A comprehensive strategy ranging from preserving our cuneiform tablets and our papyrus records up through collecting the web probably is not going to allow us to be successful unless we multifurcate that role and responsibility among research libraries. So I think we need, from the preservation professionals, a real sense of priority which links with our research library priority agenda.
Deborah, do you have any comments?
No. I assume I see there are lots of questions, so I'm leaving time for you to ask us some of the audience questions.
There's been a couple that have come in around the arena of preservation staff. We can just kind of go back to that for a moment, and there's one along the lines of, is it a matter of hiring people with new skills, or is it a matter of trying to get new skills to the people that we have on staff, or some combination thereof? And more importantly, kind of what skills are we looking for? I mean, what are the preservation competencies that we would look for in a preservation librarian or in a preservation staff? Deborah?
Well, the competencies, that's a big and detailed question, and I think the audience probably knows even better than I what those competencies might be. But I'm in favor of, I think the answer is both, to get new skills to the staff we have, to, as I said earlier in my remarks, to create opportunities for internships and involvement in the whole array of preservation activities for a wide variety of people, to be sure that our staff have the opportunity to go away to conferences, to experience professional development, bring back ideas, and not just to bring those ideas back and feel excited for a day, but actually to come back to an environment in which those ideas can be shared and kind of take root and maybe introduce some new models for preservation or any kind of work. So I think it's important to acknowledge in our libraries the importance of the preservation function, as broad as it is, and the potential role that a whole variety of people will have in furthering that cause.
Jim, any thoughts?
No, I just confirm a lot of the ideas that Deborah has advanced. I think that we're not going to see a major increase in the number of positions that we have available to us in research libraries. So therefore, we have to generalize the understanding of and appreciation and support and involvement in preservation activities. We can't isolate or focus that responsibility and role on the shoulders of a preservation director and a small number of conservators. Sometimes we can bring a richer understanding and commitment to preservation through our grants activities. So very often, if we're successful in getting a foundation or a federal grant, which has a significant preservation archiving component, we're able to get staff from across the libraries involved in that project and really build a greater understanding. If we want to look at the commitment that we're making to preservation, sometimes it's not our strategic plan because we all give sort of lip service to preservation and conservation in that planning process. We need to look at our budget. If we're not putting resources behind preservation going forward, then we are, through that action, defining it as a lower priority than other activities. And clearly we're stretched. I mean, when we reduce our binding budget, are we reallocating those resources to some other priority, or are we investing those resources in digital preservation, for example? So what are the trade-offs, what are the choices that we're making, and what is the link between our view of preservation as priority and our view of the resources that we commit to it? And this has its ramifications, its spillover in terms of the commitment we make to our staffing. And a range of expertise that we can have on our staff in the different media that we work with and the different techniques that we use for preservation. Therefore, we need to build multi-institutional strategies because it's clear that we can't replicate in 123 ARL libraries in North America that same package of preservation expertise that our collection and service programs demand.
But I do think that the conversation within our libraries about preservation issues should include people from a whole array of functions, and to look for the commonalities and the preservation elements in, whether you run the Digital Production Center or you are a conservator or you work in the stacks and you deal with books that are falling apart. To have that conversation be as broad as possible.
I agree.
Right, and it's sort of wondering if we're doing enough in libraries so we've got specialized staff working in different areas that touch upon preservation. I'm wondering how much we're doing to bring those people in the same room so they can learn from each other even. So I don't know if that's a question or a comment. Deborah, you might have something to say.
No, I agree with you. I think we should do that.
So I think we're running close to the end here. Any last thoughts from either of you?
No, thank you for the opportunity. It's been wonderful.
Yeah. I hope that this conversation does move us to look at how we can, as a research library community, build a more collaborative approach to our preservation priorities and really push for some type of leadership capacity in this area so we can deal with these really tough policy and resource issues.
Right. So I think we've neared the end here. So I think in closing, I'd like to take a moment to thank our webcast audience for joining us, to ARL for sponsoring this webcast. Many thanks to Jim, Neal, and Deborah Jakubs for their participation, of course. And I'd like to thank in particular Carla Hahn and Julia Blixrud at ARL for their guidance and support in this project. So note that the webcast will be available online very soon. The link you use to connect should lead you to the archived version of this, and also ARL will post a link on its website. And following up on what Jim said, we'll mention that the discussion will continue. I've been talking to many of you about possible venues for doing so. So watch the listservs for more on that, or feel free to get in touch with me. So again, thank you for joining us.